Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today we'll delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, where in 1916 something happened that still leaves a deep mark on the memory of that mountainous region. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from now. It's always incredible to know that people from all over the world gather here to unravel these dark mysteries of the past. The Appalachian Mountains have always held a unique atmosphere. Those mountains covered in dense forests, deep valleys where fog gathers like a grey blanket, and isolated communities that lived by their own rules. In the North Carolina of 1916, many of these communities were still virtually inaccessible. The roads were rough dirt trails, and in many places, the only way to get there was on foot or horseback. Telephones were an absolute rarity in those mountains, and news took days, sometimes weeks, to travel from one valley to the next. That year, the United States had not yet entered World War I. The country was undergoing a period of transformation, but in the mountains of North Carolina, time seemed to move differently. People still lived as their grandparents had decades before. Medicine was rudimentary, based on knowledge passed down from generation to generation. There were no nearby hospitals, and a doctor could take a whole day to reach a remote farm. Families depended on each other, and community was everything. But this same proximity that offered protection also held secrets. Secrets that could be buried deep in those mountains without anyone ever knowing. Martha Ellison was a 23-year-old woman who lived with her family on a modest property on the outskirts of Madison County. The Ellison family wasn't wealthy, but they owned enough land to grow corn, beans, and some vegetables. They raised chickens and pigs and occasionally hunted in the surrounding woods. Martha was known locally as a hard-working and reserved woman. She had dark hair tied back in a simple bun and eyes that many described as deep and thoughtful. She helped her mother with the housework, cared for her younger siblings, and rarely strayed beyond the family property. Martha's life followed the predictable rhythm of the seasons. In the spring, she helped with the planting. In the summer, she tended the garden and tended the animals. In the fall, she participated in the harvest. And in the winter, she spent long days indoors, sewing, cooking, and keeping the fire going. It was a hard existence, but Martha never complained. She seemed to accept her fate with a quiet resignation that impressed even her closest neighbors. Some said she had a distant look in her eyes, as if her thoughts were always somewhere beyond those mountains. In the early fall of 1916, something changed. Martha began acting strangely. Her mother, Sarah Ellison, noticed first. Martha spent hours staring out the window, watching the trail descend the mountain. She ate less, spoke less, and when someone spoke to her, it took her a few seconds to respond, as if she were being pulled back from a distant place. Sarah attributed it to exhaustion from the hard work of the harvest, but deep down she sensed something more, something her daughter wasn't saying. On those September nights, Martha began leaving the house. She waited until everyone was asleep, then quietly descended the wooden stairs, careful to avoid the creaking steps. She grabbed a shawl and disappeared into the darkness of the mountains. No one knew where she was going. When her younger sister, 15-year-old Elizabeth, noticed her absence and questioned Martha, she received only a cold look and a curt request not to tell her parents. Elizabeth, startled by the intensity of that look, obeyed, but fear began to grow within her. Their nearest neighbors, the Cooper family, lived about 2 miles away along the main trail. They too noticed changes. Martha, who used to greet them politely when they met at the market in the nearest village, now avoided them. She looked away, quickened her pace, and seemed to want to become invisible. Mrs. Cooper mentioned to her husband that something was wrong with the Ellison girl, but he told her not to meddle in other people's affairs. Those mountains taught people to mind their own business. In late September, Martha disappeared for an entire night. Sarah woke before dawn to prepare breakfast and realized her daughter was missing from her room. She panicked and woke her husband, Thomas Ellison. They searched the entire property, calling Martha's name, but got no answer. Thomas grabbed his shotgun not because he thought he'd need to use it, but because in the mountains, it was always wise to be prepared. He followed the most well-trodden trails, checking places where Martha usually went for firewood or water, but found no sign of her. When the sun finally broke between the mountain peaks, painting the sky orange and pink, Martha appeared. She was walking slowly along the main trail, her shawl soiled with dirt and dry leaves, her hair disheveled, and a look on her face that Sarah would never forget. It was a mix of exhaustion and something else, something that seemed like fear, but also determination. Thomas demanded to know where she had spent the night. Martha didn't answer. She simply went upstairs to her room and locked the door. That was the moment the Ellison family realized something very serious was happening. But in the mountains of North Carolina in 1916, there were issues families preferred to resolve alone. Calling authorities meant exposing the entire family to the judgment of the community. It meant admitting they had lost control. So Thomas and Sarah decided to wait. They decided to observe, and it was this decision that would lead them, weeks later, to discover a truth that would change their lives forever. The days following that mysterious night brought a suffocating tension to the Ellison household. Martha continued to go about her daily tasks, but it was as if a part of her remained in that unfamiliar place where she had spent the night. Her movements were mechanical. Her eyes rarely met anyone else's, and a heavy silence enveloped her like a permanent fog. Sarah tried to talk to her daughter several times, but Martha only shook her head and murmured that everything was fine, that she was just tired. But a mother knows her daughter, and Sarah knew this was far from just tiredness. Thomas Ellison was a man of few words, shaped by the harshness of those mountains. He had grown up believing that problems should be faced with hard work and discipline. When Martha was a child, he rarely showed affection, but he always made sure the family had food on the table and firewood for the winter. Now, faced with his daughter's inexplicable behavior, he felt powerless. He considered confronting her more firmly, perhaps even forbidding her to leave the house, but something in Martha's gaze stopped him. There was a fragility there he had never seen before, and Thomas, despite all his toughness, feared breaking her completely. Elizabeth, the younger sister, became the silent observer of it all. She shared Martha's room, and for the next few nights she would lie awake, pretending to sleep, watching her sister. Martha would sit for hours on the edge of the bed, staring out the small window that overlooked the mountains. Sometimes Elizabeth would see her crying softly, tears streaming silently down her face. Other times, Martha seemed to be talking to someone invisible, her lips moving soundlessly. Elizabeth wanted to help, wanted to hug her sister and tell her everything would be okay, but fear paralyzed her. There was something happening that was beyond her comprehension, something that belonged to the adult world and its shadows. In mid-October, an unexpected event added new elements to the already tense situation. A traveling salesman passed through the area, as he occasionally did. These men traveled from property to property, selling fabrics, tools, home remedies, and bringing news from other parts of the county. It was one of the few ways these isolated communities had of keeping up with the world beyond their mountains. The salesman, a man named Henry Whitfield in his 40s, stopped at the Ellison property as he had done a few times in the past. Sarah bought a few yards of fabric and a can of kerosene. As Henry arranged his goods on the wagon pulled by a tired mule, he mentioned something that made Sarah freeze. He said that on other farms farther north, near Yancey County, there were strange rumors circulating. There was talk of nocturnal gatherings in the woods, of people disappearing for a few hours and returning transformed. No one knew exactly what was happening, but there was a growing climate of distrust. Some families had begun locking their doors more carefully, and parents forbade their children from going out after dark. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She asked Henry if he knew any more details, but the salesman just shook his head. He said they were just rumors, probably exaggerated stories told by superstitious people, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced himself. Before leaving, Henry glanced around as if checking if anyone else was listening, and quietly told Sarah that she should keep her family safe, especially the young women. Then he whipped the mule and headed off down the trail, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. That night, Sarah told Thomas about her conversation with Henry Whitfield. Her husband initially dismissed it as silly superstition, the kind of stories uneducated people made up to explain things they didn't understand. But Sarah insisted there was a connection to Martha's behavior. She argued that perhaps her daughter was involved in something that happened at those mysterious meetings. Thomas was silent for a long time, staring into the fire crackling in the grate. Finally, he said he would go to the village the next day to speak with the county sheriff. The nearest village, called Shelton Creek, was about 8 miles from the Ellison property. It was a small place with no more than 200 people, but it had a general store, a Methodist church, and an office that served as the sheriff's station. Thomas left before dawn, riding his sturdiest horse, and it took him nearly 3 hours to reach it. The sheriff was a man named Robert Doherty. who had taken office less than a year earlier. He was young for the job, only 32, but he was respected for his honesty and for not being afraid to ride into the most remote parts of the county when necessary. Thomas explained the situation as best he could, omitting some details out of embarrassment, but making it clear that he was concerned for his daughter. Sheriff Doherty listened attentively, asking a few pointed questions. He too had heard the rumors Henry Whitfield had mentioned. In fact, other families had begun contacting him with similar concerns. Young people acting strangely, unexplained nighttime absences, a general air of unease hanging over that part of the Appalachian Mountains. Doherty told Thomas he was investigating, but admitted it was difficult to find concrete evidence when people refused to speak openly. The sheriff made a suggestion that Thomas initially vehemently rejected. He suggested that Martha be examined by a doctor. There was a doctor in Marshall, about 20 miles away, who occasionally visited Shelton Creek. Perhaps Martha was ill in some way that was affecting her behavior. Thomas argued that his daughter wasn't ill, that this was different, but Doherty insisted. He explained that sometimes mental illnesses could make people act in incomprehensible ways, and that it was important to rule out that possibility before considering other explanations. Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to think about it. When Thomas returned home, it was late afternoon. He found Sarah visibly shaken. During his absence, something had happened. Martha had had some kind of breakdown. Elizabeth said that in the morning, while they were working together in the kitchen, preparing preserves, Martha suddenly dropped the knife she was holding and began to tremble. Her eyes widened as if she were seeing something terrible, and she began repeating a phrase in a low, barely audible voice. Elizabeth couldn't fully understand the words, but she caught fragments. Something about being unable to stop, about promises that had been made, about a price that had to be paid. Sarah had run to the kitchen when she heard Elizabeth scream for help. She found Martha huddled on the floor, hugging her knees, rocking back and forth like a frightened child. It took almost an hour to calm her down, and even afterward, Martha remained in a state of semi-consciousness, answering questions in monosyllables or simply remaining silent. Sarah had managed to get Martha to go upstairs to her room and lie down, and since then she hadn't moved. She lay there, lying on her side, staring at the wall, completely oblivious to the world around her. Thomas climbed the heavy stairs to his daughter's room. He opened the door slowly and saw Martha exactly as Sarah had described. Elizabeth was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, watching her sister with frightened eyes. Thomas asked Elizabeth to come down and leave them alone. Then he approached the bed and sat on the edge. He placed his hand on Martha's shoulder and felt how cold she was, despite the blankets. He began to speak, in the softest voice he could find within himself. He told her he loved her, that the whole family loved her, and that no matter what had happened, they would find a way. He begged her to trust him, to tell him what was happening. For a long moment, Martha didn't react. Thomas was about to give up when she finally turned to face him. Her eyes were red from crying, and there was a depth of grief in them that broke his father's heart. Martha opened her mouth as if to speak, but then seemed to change her mind. She shook her head slowly, and whispered just 3 words that would echo in Thomas's mind for years to come. She said it was too late. Too late for what? Thomas didn't know. But in that moment, as the sun set behind the mountains and shadows crept into the room, he understood that his daughter was trapped in something far beyond his ability to help. Night fell over the Appalachian Mountains with its characteristic darkness, the kind of darkness that seems to have substance, pressing against the windows and seeping through the cracks in the doors. The Ellison family ate dinner in near silence, only the sound of silverware clanging against cheap china plates echoing through the kitchen. Martha didn't come down to eat. Sarah had come up with a plate, but her daughter barely touched the food, simply moving the pieces of potato and meat around before asking to be left alone. Thomas sat in his chair by the fireplace after dinner, smoking his cornpipe, his eyes fixed on the hypnotically dancing flames. He made a decision. The next morning he would take Martha to Marshall to see the doctor, no matter how much she resisted. But the next morning brought a discovery that would completely change the course of that story. Elizabeth woke first, as she always did, just before dawn. She had developed a habit of waking early to check if Martha was still in bed. That morning, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the room, she saw that Martha's side was empty. Elizabeth's heart raced. She threw off the blankets and ran downstairs, screaming her sister's name. Sarah and Thomas woke with a start, and soon the whole house was in frenetic motion. This time, however, Martha hadn't gone far. Thomas found her in the barn, about 50 yards behind the main house. She stood in the center of the dusty space, lit only by the first faint rays of dawn filtering through the poorly fitted planks of the walls. Martha held something in her hands, something Thomas couldn't initially identify. When he approached, calling her name softly so as not to startle her, he saw it was a small bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Martha looked at her father with an expression that blended despair and a strange serenity, as if she had finally reached some kind of inevitable conclusion. Thomas asked what she was holding. Martha didn't answer immediately. She clutched the bundle to her chest protectively, then began to speak. Her voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used properly in a long time, but the words finally came out. She said she needed to tell him everything, that she couldn't carry the weight alone anymore. Thomas gestured for her to continue, his heart pounding, unsure if he really wanted to hear what was coming next. Martha then began to tell a story that sounded like something out of one's worst nightmares, a story that would expose not only her own secrets, but also something much darker happening in those mountains. It had all started the previous summer, in June of 1915. Martha had gone to the village of Shelton Creek to buy some provisions for her mother. It was a hot day, and she had stopped near the creek that ran beside the main road to drink water and rest in the shade of an ancient oak tree. It was there that she met a man named Silas Garner. He was a few years older than her, perhaps 30, and had recently moved to the area from somewhere in Tennessee. Silas was different from the men Martha had known. He spoke eloquently, had a polite manner, and his clear blue eyes seemed to see right through her. Silas began to chat with Martha casually, asking about the area, the best mountain trails, and the families who lived there. Martha, who rarely spoke to strangers, felt strangely comfortable in this man's presence. He had a way of speaking that made her feel important, as if her opinions truly mattered. When Martha finally got up to continue on her way, Silas asked if he could see her again. Martha knew she should say no, that decent young women didn't meet men without a chaperone, but something in her agreed before her rational mind could intervene. Their encounters began innocently enough. Martha and Silas would occasionally see each other near the stream, always during the day, always in places where they could see if anyone approached. They talked about everything and nothing. Silas told stories about places he'd visited, big cities where people lived in ways Martha could barely imagine. He talked about books he'd read, ideas he'd had about the world. Martha, who had attended school for only 4 years before needing to help full-time on the farm, drank in every word as if they were drops of water in a desert. For the first time in her life, she felt there was something beyond those mountains, beyond the endless grind of work and survival. As the months passed, their meetings changed. Silas began to talk about strange things. He mentioned ancient knowledge, practices that had been forgotten by most, but were still preserved by those who knew where to look. He spoke of how certain people had special abilities, ways of influencing the world around them that went beyond common understanding. Initially, Martha thought they were just stories, perhaps superstitions Silas had picked up on his travels. But he spoke with such conviction, in such detail, that gradually she began to question her own certainties. It was in September, a little over a year after they met, that Silas extended the invitation. He told Martha that there was a group of people who met in the mountains, people who sought knowledge and power beyond what ordinary society offered. He told her that Martha had potential, that there was something special about her that he had recognized from the very first moment. He said that if she wanted to experience a different life, if she wanted to control her own destiny, instead of simply accepting what was imposed on her, she should come with him to one of these meetings. Martha knew she should refuse. Every fiber of her upbringing and education screamed at her to say no, but there was a deep curiosity within her, a hunger for something more, and that hunger overcame her hesitations. The first meeting took place in a clearing deep in the forest, a place Martha had never seen before despite growing up in those mountains. Silas led her along nearly invisible trails, marked only by small signs that only those in the know could interpret. When they arrived, Martha saw about 15 people gathered around a campfire. There were men and women, some young like her, some older. Everyone looked at her when she arrived, and Martha felt exposed under their gazes. But Silas placed a comforting hand on her back and guided her into the circle. What happened that night was hard to explain, Martha told Thomas, as tears began to stream down her face. There were chants in a language she didn't recognize, herbal smoke that made her head spin, and promises of power and freedom. The leader of the group was a woman called Only Lady Blackwood, an imposing figure with grey hair and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. She spoke of how the world was changing, how old forms of power were being forgotten, and how those present were the keepers of ancient knowledge. Martha, enveloped by the hypnotic atmosphere of that gathering, felt part of something bigger, something important. The meetings continued. Martha began leaving on the nights Thomas and Sarah had noticed, always guided by Silas, always returning before dawn. But something began to change. The group's practices became more intense, more demanding. Mrs. Blackwood spoke of necessary sacrifices, of how true power required total commitment. Martha began to feel afraid, but at the same time she felt trapped. Silas told her it was too late to leave, that she had seen too much, knew too much. He said that if she tried to leave the group, there would be consequences not only for her, but for her family. Martha was terrified, but she felt completely powerless. The bundle Martha held, she finally explained to Thomas in a trembling voice, contained objects given to her by Lady Blackwood. They were symbols of her commitment to the group, talismans she was to keep with her at all times. Martha said she had tried to get rid of them many times, throwing them in the river or burying them in the forest, but every time she did, terrible things happened. Farm animals fell ill, storms destroyed part of the harvest, Elizabeth developed unexplained fevers. Martha was convinced this was all a result of her attempt to break away from the group. She felt cursed, trapped in a web from which she could not escape. Thomas listened in growing silence. Part of him wanted to believe his daughter was delirious, that this was the product of some mental illness. But he knew these mountains, knew the stories that had circulated for generations about strange things happening in the most remote places. He knew there were people who practiced dark arts, who met in secret and did things that defied comprehension. Thomas took the package from Martha's trembling hands and carefully opened it. Inside were objects that made his stomach churn. Small bones bound with strands of hair, stones engraved with symbols, a piece of cloth stained with what looked like dried blood. He quickly closed the package and looked at his daughter with a mixture of horror and compassion. Thomas clutched the package as if it were burning his hands, but his voice remained firm as he told Martha that this had to end immediately. He asked where the meetings were, who the other people involved were, and most importantly, where he could find this Silas Garner and Mrs. Blackwood. Martha shook her head desperately, saying she couldn't reveal anything, that they would know if she did, that there were ways to tell when someone was betraying the group. Thomas, struggling to remain calm, explained that these were just manipulations, psychological tricks used to keep people under control through fear. But Martha was so deeply involved in this web of terror that his words barely seemed to reach her. Sarah had followed Thomas to the barn and heard the last fragments of his confession. She entered silently and embraced her daughter, who collapsed into convulsive sobs in her mother's arms. Sarah stroked Martha's hair as she murmured comforting words, but her own eyes were filled with tears. The Ellison family had been devout Methodists for generations, and Sarah felt as if the devil himself had his claws in her daughter. But stronger than fear was maternal love, that primal force that drives a mother to fight against anything that threatened her children. Sarah looked at Thomas and saw the same determination reflected in his eyes. They would not allow Martha to remain trapped in that darkness. The decision was made right there in that dusty barn as daylight finally fully illuminated the space. Thomas would go to Sheriff Dougherty again, but this time he would tell the whole story. No longer did he care about the shame or what the neighbors would think. Martha's life was at stake, and possibly the lives of other young people who had been seduced by this group. Sarah would stay home with her daughters, and no one would leave the property until Thomas returned. They would lock all the doors and windows, and Thomas would leave his loaded shotgun with Sarah, just in case. Martha, exhausted physically and emotionally, was taken back inside and placed in bed under Elizabeth's watchful care. Thomas saddled his horse and set off immediately. It was still mid-morning when he reached Shelton Creek. Sheriff Dougherty was in his office, reviewing some documents when Thomas stormed in. The older man, normally restrained and measured in his words, spilled the entire story in one go, speaking so quickly that he sometimes had to stop to catch his breath. Dougherty listened without interrupting, his expression growing more somber with each revelation. When Thomas finally finished, the sheriff was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the worn wooden desk. Sheriff Dougherty then revealed something that made Thomas's blood run cold. He said that over the past 3 months, he had received similar reports from other families in different parts of the county. Young people, mostly women, but also some men, had drastically changed their behavior. Some had disappeared completely and were never found. Others returned home in a state of profound mental disturbance, unable or unwilling to explain where they had been. There were also reports of animals found dead in peculiar ways, strange markings carved into trees in certain areas of the forest, and witnesses who swore they had seen campfires in remote locations during the night. Doherty had tried to investigate, but he always ran into the same problem he now understood better. The victims were afraid to speak out. They had been convinced that something terrible would happen if they revealed what they knew. The sheriff had even organized a few searches in the forests, but the Appalachian Mountains were vast, with thousands of clearings, caves, and isolated valleys. Finding a group that didn't want to be found was like looking for a needle in a vast haystack. But now, with Martha willing to cooperate, perhaps there was finally a chance to dismantle this sinister operation. Doherty told Thomas he needed to speak to Martha in person as soon as possible. The two men rode together back to the Ellison estate, arriving mid-afternoon. Sarah greeted the sheriff with evident nervousness, wiping her hands repeatedly on her apron as she explained that Martha had finally fallen asleep after drinking a calming tea Sarah had made with valerian root. Doherty said it was okay, that he could wait until Martha woke up. He needed her to be lucid and calm to provide accurate information. While they waited, the sheriff examined the package Thomas had saved. He recognized some of the objects from other cases he had investigated in the past, confirming that there was indeed a pattern, a shared methodology. When Martha finally came downstairs late in the afternoon, her eyes were puffy, but there was a determination in her that hadn't been there before. It was as if her confession to Thomas and Sarah had broken a dam, and now the words flowed more easily. She sat at the kitchen table with Sheriff Doherty, and for the next 2 hours provided every detail she could remember. She described the approximate location of the clearing where the meetings were held, citing natural landmarks like a specific rock formation and a stream that curved in a peculiar way. She gave the names of some people she had seen at the meetings, though many used only nicknames or referred to each other by symbols. Martha spoke about Silas Garner, describing him in detail. She said he didn't live in any permanent location that she knew of, but occasionally mentioned staying in an abandoned cabin somewhere near Yancey County. Martha knew even less about Mrs. Blackwood. She was extremely cautious, never revealing anything personal, and the others in the group treated her with a mixture of reverence and fear that suggested she held some kind of power or influence over them all. Martha mentioned that Mrs. Blackwood sometimes spoke of having connections in distant places, other communities that practiced the same rituals, forming a kind of invisible network across the mountains. The most disturbing aspect of Martha's account was when she described what actually happened during the meetings. She spoke of how they were taught to create the talismans, using materials that had to be obtained in specific ways. Some had to be made during certain phases of the moon. Others required ingredients that were difficult to obtain and that Martha preferred not to detail. There were also rituals involving oaths of loyalty, where each person had to offer something of personal value as a symbol of their commitment. Martha had given a medallion that had belonged to her grandmother, something she never told her family she had lost. But what frightened Martha most, she revealed with a trembling voice, was the feeling that her own mind was no longer completely her own. She described moments when she would wake up without remembering how she had gotten home, periods where she would lose hours unable to reconstruct what she had done during that time. There were also intense dreams, almost hallucinations, in which she saw Mrs. Blackwood giving her instructions, ordering her to do things. Martha couldn't tell if they were just dreams or if there was something more going on, some form of influence beyond her comprehension. Sheriff Doherty took careful notes, but even he, a pragmatic man accustomed to dealing with common crimes, seemed disturbed by what he was hearing. When Martha finally finished, it was getting dark outside. Doherty closed his notebook and looked at the family gathered around the table. He said he would need a few days to organize a proper operation. He couldn't investigate alone. He would need more men, perhaps enlisting the help of the Yancey County Sheriff if Silas's cabin was indeed in that jurisdiction. He also wanted to speak with some of the other families who had made similar reports, see if he could find more witnesses willing to cooperate, now that Martha had taken the first courageous step. Doherty assured the Ellison family that he would do everything in his power to put an end to this situation. But then he issued a stern warning. If the group truly possessed the surveillance capabilities Martha described, they might already know she had spoken to the authorities. Doherty instructed the family to be extremely cautious, No one was to leave the property alone, especially Martha. All doors and windows were to be locked at night. If they saw anyone unfamiliar approaching, or noticed anything unusual, they were to fire 3 shots into the air, a danger signal recognized by neighbors that could bring help. Thomas assured them they would follow every precaution. The sheriff then mounted his horse and rode off, disappearing into the gathering darkness as the Ellison family braced themselves for what they hoped would be just a quiet night before justice finally struck. But fate had other plans. That night, as the family tried to sleep despite the tension permeating every room in the house, something was moving in the shadows of the mountains. Silent figures walked along trails known only to them, slowly approaching the Ellison estate. Mrs. Blackwood had indeed discovered Martha's betrayal, and she was not one to let betrayals go unanswered. What would unfold in the next few hours would test the Ellison family's mettle in ways they could never have imagined, and would forever change not only their lives, but also the history of this region of the Appalachian Mountains. The night wore on with an unnatural stillness. Not even the crickets sang, and the wind that normally whistled through the pines was strangely absent. Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay beside Sarah, listening to his wife's irregular breathing, as she also pretended to be asleep. Upstairs, Martha and Elizabeth shared the tense silence of those who know something is about to happen, but can't quite put their finger on it. The Ellison house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The candles had been extinguished hours ago, and only faint starlight filtered through the thick curtains covering the windows. It was about 2 in the morning when Thomas heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, but in that absolute stillness even the slightest noise became amplified. It was the sound of footsteps, not the heavy thuds of a bear or a deer, but deliberate multiple human steps coming from different directions. Thomas silently got out of bed, grabbed his shotgun, which he kept loaded next to the bedroom door, and moved to the window. Carefully he parted the curtain a small crack and peered out. What he saw made his heart race. There were people around the property. Thomas counted at least 6 figures, maybe more, moving like shadows among the trees. All wore dark clothing that blended into the night, and some carried low torches that barely illuminated the ground in front of them. They didn't approach the house directly, but formed a sort of perimeter around the property, as if performing some kind of ritual. Thomas saw one of the figures stop near the barn and begin making marks on the ground with what looked like a stick or twig. Another figure was tying something to a tree near the house. The whole scene had a dreamlike quality, as if Thomas were watching something that shouldn't exist in the real world. Sarah had also stood and was now beside her husband, her hand gripping his arm tightly enough to leave marks. She whispered, asking what they should do if they should fire the 3 warning shots as the sheriff had instructed. Thomas hesitated. If he fired now, it would certainly scare those figures, but it would also reveal that the family was awake and aware of his presence. He didn't know if these people were armed, didn't know their exact intentions. He decided to wait, observe, keep the family safe inside the house as long as possible. The doors were locked, the windows closed. As long as no one tried to force their way in, perhaps this was simply some kind of psychological intimidation. Upstairs, Martha had woken with an overwhelming sense of dread. She hadn't heard the sounds that had alerted Thomas, but something inside her, some deep instinct, screamed danger. She got out of bed and went to her bedroom window, which overlooked the back of the property. When she looked out, she saw something that nearly made her legs buckle. Silas Garner stood there at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint starlight. He was staring directly at her bedroom window, as if he knew exactly where she would be. His arms were outstretched in an awkward position, and his lips moved in words Martha couldn't hear but recognized. He was performing some kind of invocation, calling to her. Martha felt an overwhelming compulsion to open the window, go downstairs, leave the house, and go to Silas. It was as if invisible strings were pulling her, as if her will were slowly being dissolved. She took a step toward the bedroom door before Elizabeth, who had woken with her sister's movement, grabbed her arm. Elizabeth asked what was happening, and the sound of her younger sister's voice was enough to momentarily break her trance. Martha blinked, half recovering, and then began to cry silently. She told Elizabeth to call her parents, not to leave her alone, because she didn't trust herself at that moment. Thomas ran upstairs when Elizabeth called out to him. He found Martha huddled on the bedroom floor, hugging her knees and rocking back and forth. When he looked out the window and saw Silas, a deep, primal rage washed over him. This man had seduced his daughter, had involved her in dark practices, and now had the audacity to come to his property and threaten his family. Thomas raised his shotgun, but Sarah, who had climbed in right behind him, grabbed his arm. She whispered that he couldn't shoot someone who wasn't technically trespassing, that it could bring legal trouble to the family. But mostly she feared what these people might do in retaliation. As if he'd heard Sarah's thought, Silas suddenly lowered his arms and smiled. It was a smile Thomas could see even in the darkness, a smile that promised consequences. Then Silas turned and walked slowly back into the forest, disappearing into the trees as if swallowed by the darkness itself. The other figures around the property also began to retreat, moving in near-perfect synchrony, as if they'd received some silent signal. In less than 5 minutes there was no one else visible around the house, but the sense of threat didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified. Thomas decided they couldn't wait until dawn. He needed to go to the village immediately to fetch Sheriff Doherty. Sarah argued that it was too dangerous to ride alone in the dark, especially with those people still nearby, but Thomas was determined. He couldn't just wait there helplessly, while his family was clearly in danger. Sarah then suggested that perhaps it would be best for them all to go together, leave the house and seek refuge in the village until the situation was resolved. Thomas considered the idea. It would be difficult to move the entire family in the dark, especially with Martha in her current state, but perhaps it would be safer than remaining there. While the parents debated what to do, something else was happening. Martha, who had been relatively quiet for the past few minutes, suddenly stood up. Her eyes had a glazed quality, as if she were only partially present. She began walking toward the bedroom door with slow, deliberate steps. Elizabeth tried to hold her back, but Martha pushed her with surprising force, throwing her younger sister against the wall. Thomas turned and saw Martha already at the top of the stairs, starting to descend. He dropped the shotgun and ran after her, catching up with her just as she was at the front door. Thomas grabbed Martha by the shoulders and turned her to face him. His daughter's eyes didn't recognize him. It was as if she was sleepwalking, caught in some state between wakefulness and unconsciousness. Martha mumbled something about needing to go, about promises that had been made, about debts that needed to be paid. She fought her father with desperate force, clawing at his arms, trying to break free. It took all his strength to hold her back, and even then it was difficult. Sarah rushed downstairs and helped restrain Martha, and together they managed to drag her back upstairs and lock her in the room. They placed a heavy chair against the door, knowing it was a temporary solution, but having no better alternatives. Inside the room, Martha continued trying to escape for nearly half an hour. She pounded on the door, screamed, cried, begged to be released. Then, as suddenly as she had begun, she stopped. Thomas, Sarah, and Elizabeth listened through the door as Martha walked back to the bed. There was silence for a few minutes, and then they heard Martha begin to sing. It was a strange melody, in a language none of them recognized, but it carried a hypnotic and deeply disturbing quality. Martha's voice didn't sound like her normal voice. It was deeper, with strange harmonics, as if multiple voices were singing through her at once. Sarah began to pray, her words coming out in a hurried murmur as she made the sign of the cross repeatedly. Thomas felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet, though rationally he knew it was solid. Elizabeth covered her ears with her hands, trying to block out the disturbing chanting, and then, as abruptly as it had begun, there was absolute silence. The chanting stopped. Thomas waited a few seconds before carefully removing the chair and opening the bedroom door. Martha lay in bed, apparently fast asleep, her breathing slow and regular, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Thomas closed the door again and went downstairs with Sarah and Elizabeth. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, neither speaking for a long time. The dim light from an oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. She said this was beyond their capacity to handle. It wasn't just a group of people practicing strange rituals. There was something more going on, something that defied rational explanation. She implored Thomas to seek out not only the sheriff, but also the reverend at Shelton Creek Methodist Church. Perhaps a man of faith could offer help where the law could not. Thomas agreed. As soon as the first hint of light began to appear on the eastern horizon, he would set off for the village. But until then, they needed to remain vigilant. Thomas picked up his shotgun again and positioned himself near the living room window, where he had a good view of the front of the property. Sarah and Elizabeth sat close together on the sofa, a blanket draped over them, waiting for the night to finally end. The hours dragged by with painful slowness. Every creak of the house, every sound from the surrounding forest made them jump, but the shadowy figures didn't return. at least not visibly. When the first rays of dawn finally began to paint the sky a pale gray, Thomas prepared to leave. He gave Sarah strict instructions to keep everything locked and not to open the door to anyone except him, the sheriff, or the reverend. He gave Sarah his shotgun, showing her again how to use it if necessary, though he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Then he saddled his faster horse and galloped down the trail to Shelton Creek, the trees blurring around him as he pushed the animal to its maximum speed. Thomas didn't know it, but what he would find in the village would completely change his understanding of what he was facing and reveal that the situation was far more serious and widespread than anyone had imagined. The ride to Shelton Creek seemed to take forever, even though Thomas had made it in record time. His horse was covered in foam when they finally reached the village shortly after 7 in the morning. The place was unusually quiet for that hour. Normally, there would already be activity at the general store, people coming and going, preparing for another day of work. But that morning the streets were deserted, and there was a heavy atmosphere in the air that Thomas couldn't explain. He tied his horse in front of the sheriff's office and knocked urgently on the door. There was no answer. Thomas knocked again, louder this time, and then tried the doorknob. The door was unlocked. He entered cautiously, calling Sheriff Dougherty's name. The office was empty, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. Papers scattered on the desk, a still warm cup of coffee, a lantern still lit despite the daylight beginning to filter through the window. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. He left the office and looked around the town square. Finally, he saw a figure. Mrs. Hutchins, an elderly woman who lived above the general store and always woke up early. Thomas ran to her and asked if she'd seen Sheriff Dougherty. Mrs. Hutchins looked at him with frightened eyes and pointed to the Methodist church at the end of the street. She said there had been a lot of commotion during the night, that people had run through the streets screaming, and that the sheriff had ordered everyone to gather at the church. She said she didn't know exactly what had happened, but that some people were talking about a fire, others about someone being found dead. The confusion was so intense that no one could give clear information. Mrs. Hutchins said she was too scared to leave the house, and that Thomas should be careful. Thomas quickly thanked him and hurried toward the church. When he got there, he found about 30 people gathered outside, talking in small groups with low voices and tense expressions. He recognized several of them, families who lived in and around the village. Everyone turned as Thomas approached, and he saw in their eyes the same mix of fear and distrust he had felt in his own home. Thomas asked loudly where Sheriff Dougherty was. A man named Jacob Reeves stepped forward and said the sheriff was inside the church with Reverend Walsh and a few others, dealing with a situation. Before Thomas could ask what the situation was, the church door opened and Sheriff Dougherty stepped out. He looked like he had aged 10 years since Thomas had seen him the day before. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes were wrinkled and dirty. When he saw Thomas, something like relief crossed his face. He motioned for Thomas to follow him back into the church. Thomas complied, feeling the eyes of everyone present glued to his back as he entered the wooden building that served as the community's spiritual center. Inside the church, light filtering through the single-pane windows created patterns on the floor. Reverend Walsh, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a typically gentle expression, sat in one of the front pews, his head in his hands. Beside him sat a woman Thomas recognized as Helen Porter, the wife of a local farmer. She was weeping silently, wrapped in a blanket despite the rising morning heat. 2 or 3 other people were scattered throughout the pews, all with expressions of profound shock. Sheriff Dougherty led Thomas to a far corner and began speaking quietly. He recounted that during the night, the Porter family home had been broken into. Mr. Porter, a strong, healthy man of 40, had been found dead in his own barn in the early hours of the morning. There were no obvious signs of violence on his body, no wounds, no bleeding, but his eyes were wide with an expression of absolute terror, and there were strange markings around where he had been found. Symbols drawn on the floor with what appeared to be ash, peculiar objects left around the body. His wife, Helen, had woken up alone in bed and gone looking for her husband, finding the horrific scene that now left her in a state of near collapse. But that wasn't all, Dougherty continued. During the same night, 3 other properties on the outskirts of the village had reported similar break-ins. No one else had been killed, but warning signs had been left in all of them. Strange objects hung from doors, marks carved into trees near the houses, and in one case a pet found mysteriously dead. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was sending a message, and that message was clear. Whoever was behind this had power, reach, and would not hesitate to use both against anyone who threatened to expose them. Thomas felt his legs grow weak. He told the sheriff about what had happened on his property during the night, about the figures around the house, about Silas and the state Martha had been left in. Doherty listened to it all and then rubbed his face with his hands, a gesture of profound exhaustion and frustration. He said he had sent a messenger at dawn to get help from the sheriff's office in Marshall and that he had dispatched another to Yancey County. But both places were hours away and help wouldn't arrive until the end of the day at the earliest. Until then, they were essentially alone. Reverend Walsh joined the conversation at that moment. He had heard some of what Thomas had said and had something to add. He said that in recent months, he had noticed subtle changes in some members of his congregation. People who had always been devout suddenly stopped attending services. When he went to visit them to check on them, he was met with vague excuses and evasive behavior. He had attributed it to personal problems or perhaps doubts of faith, something common even among the most religious. But now, hearing about what was happening, he began to understand that these changes were symptoms of something much more sinister. Walsh said that there were ancient accounts in Christian tradition of practices that predated Christianity, practices that had never been completely eradicated but that occasionally resurfaced in remote places. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to sound delusional, but making it clear that he believed there were forces at work here that went beyond the merely human. He offered to do whatever he could to help, whether through prayer or his physical presence, if the affected families desired some kind of spiritual protection. Thomas immediately agreed. He asked the Reverend to accompany him back to his property. Sarah would feel more at ease knowing a man of faith was present, and Thomas secretly hoped the Reverend's presence might somehow help Martha. Doherty agreed it was a good idea and said he would go as well. Before they left, however, he wanted to do something. Doherty emerged from the church and called the attention of everyone gathered outside. He loudly announced that he was forming a group of volunteer men to patrol the area during the day, and especially during the following night. The response was mixed. Some men immediately volunteered, driven by fear of what had happened and the need to protect their own families. Others hesitated, visibly torn between the desire to help and the terror of becoming targets. A man named William Mackey voiced what many were wondering. He asked how they could fight something they didn't even understand against people who seemed to have capabilities that defied explanation. He mentioned the rumors about Mr. Porter having no marks on his body despite being clearly dead, about how these people managed to move through the woods undetected, about how they knew things they shouldn't have. Sheriff Doherty responded with a firmness he probably didn't fully feel himself. He said that no matter how strange or frightening the circumstances, they were ultimately dealing with people. People who could be tracked, captured, and brought to justice. He admitted he didn't have all the answers, but said the alternative was to simply surrender to fear and allow these people to continue operating freely, terrorizing entire communities. He appealed to the men's sense of responsibility, their duty to protect their families and neighbors. Gradually, more men began volunteering. Eventually, Doherty had about 15 men willing to help. A plan was quickly hatched. Half the men would remain in the village, protecting the families who had taken refuge there and keeping watch on nearby properties. The other half would split into smaller groups to patrol the main trails and check the more isolated farms. Doherty, Thomas, and Reverend Walsh would travel together to the Ellison property. From there, depending on what they found and Martha's condition, they would decide their next steps. Perhaps if Martha could provide more precise directions, they could finally locate the clearing where the meetings were held and possibly capture some members of the group. The three men set out from Shelton Creek on fresh horses, leaving Thomas's to rest in the village stable. Reverend Walsh carried his Bible and a small vial of holy water, items he hoped he would never need but had brought just in case. Doherty had his regulation sidearm and a borrowed rifle. Thomas was unarmed, having left his shotgun with Sarah, but he felt safer in a group. As they rode along the familiar trails, the sun already high in the sky, neither of them said much. Each was lost in their own thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours and mentally preparing for what might yet lie ahead. When they finally spotted the Ellison property in the distance, Thomas felt a wave of relief when he saw that the house was still standing and apparently intact. There were no signs of smoke or any obvious disturbance, but as they approached, Thomas noticed something that made his heart race. It was too quiet. The chickens that normally pecked around the yard were nowhere to be seen. The family dog, a stray named Rusty who always barked at strangers, showed no sign of life. Thomas spurred his horse, racing the last few feet to the house, jumping off before it even came to a complete stop. He ran to the front door and found it ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Thomas entered, calling for Sarah, for Elizabeth, for Martha. There was no answer. The house was empty. He ran from room to room, checking every space, stumbling up the stairs to the bedrooms. Nothing. No one. The shotgun he had left with Sarah lay on the living room floor, unfired. There were signs of a struggle. An overturned chair, a few objects knocked over, but no blood, no evidence of extreme violence. It was as if the three women had simply disappeared. Doherty and Walsh entered right behind Thomas and quickly assessed the situation. The sheriff began searching for clues, while the Reverend tried to calm Thomas, who was on the verge of panic. It was when they looked out the back window that they saw it. At the edge of the forest, clearly visible from where they were, something was hanging from a tree. It was a piece of fabric, and even from a distance, Thomas recognized the pattern. It was part of Martha's dress. Thomas ran out the back door before Doherty or Walsh could stop him. His feet barely touched the ground as he crossed the yard toward the tree line, where the piece of fabric swayed gently in the morning breeze. As he got closer, he could see it wasn't just the fabric. There was also something tied to it, something that made his stomach churn. It was a braid of hair, the same dark brown as Martha's, interwoven with lighter strands that could have belonged to Sarah or Elizabeth. The message was clear and cruel. They had their family. Sheriff Doherty caught up with Thomas and examined the fabric without touching him. He searched for footprints around the tree and found recent marks, multiple people, leading deeper into the forest. The footprints followed a trail Thomas knew, an old trail that led up the mountain toward a particularly dense and remote area. Doherty looked at Thomas and saw in the man's face a mixture of desperation and fierce determination. He knew there was no way to stop Thomas from following that trail, so the only option was to go with him and try to maintain some control over the situation before it became even more dangerous. Reverend Walsh suggested they return to the village to look for the other men, saying it would be suicidal to go forward alone against a group of unknown size. But Thomas shook his head violently. He said every minute that passed was another minute his family was in the hands of these people, another minute that something terrible could happen to them. There was no time to turn back, gather people, and return. They needed to move on now, while the trail was still fresh. Doherty weighed his options quickly and agreed. He told Walsh to return to the village, get reinforcements, and lead them along the same trail. In the meantime, he and Thomas would continue on, keeping a safe distance and simply observing until help arrived. But Walsh refused. He said that if souls were in danger, especially if people were under some kind of evil influence, then his presence might be necessary. He had sworn an oath to serve his flock, and that included times of danger. Besides, he argued, perhaps his presence as a man of faith could offer some protection, or at least some comfort. Thomas had no time to argue. He simply began following the tracks, moving quickly, but trying to remain silent. Doherty and Walsh followed, and the three men entered the forest, which quickly closed around them like a dark mouth closing. The trail climbed steadily, becoming narrower and more difficult with each step. Low-hanging branches scraped their faces, exposed roots threatened to trip them, and sunlight increasingly filtered through the dense canopy of foliage overhead. The footprints remained clear in the damp soil, and occasionally Thomas saw other marks. A scrap of cloth caught in a bush, a fresh mark on a tree as if something heavy had been dragged against it. These people weren't trying to hide their path. It was almost as if they wanted to be followed, as if they were leading Thomas and his companions somewhere specific. After about 40 minutes of arduous walking, they began to hear sounds. At first, they were just distant murmurs, but gradually they became clearer. Multiple human voices speaking or perhaps singing in a rhythmic rhythm. Thomas signaled for Doherty and Walsh to stop. They were close to something, and they needed to proceed with extreme caution. The three men crouched low and began moving more slowly, using the trees and bushes for cover. The sound of the voices grew louder, and now they could make out that it was indeed a kind of chanting, words they couldn't understand, intertwined in a melody that sounded ancient and deeply disturbing. Finally, they reached the edge of a clearing. It was the place Martha had described, Thomas was sure. The peculiar rock formation was there, rising on one side of the clearing like stone fingers reaching for the sky. In the center, despite the broad daylight, a bonfire stood, the flames dancing and sending smoke spiraling upward. Around the bonfire stood about 20 people, all dressed in simple, dark clothing. And there, in the center of the circle, Thomas saw what he had come for. Sarah, Elizabeth, and Martha stood side by side, their eyes closed, swaying slightly to the rhythm of the chant. They didn't appear to be bound or physically restrained, but it was obvious they were under some kind of control. At the head of the three women stood a figure who could only be Mrs. Blackwood. She was a tall woman with loose grey hair falling over her shoulders, wearing something that looked like a cross between street clothes and some kind of ceremonial robe. Her arms were raised, and she was clearly the one leading the ritual. Beside her, Thomas recognized Silas Garner, his cold blue eyes sweeping the clearing with an expression of arrogant satisfaction. There were other members of the circle Thomas didn't recognize, but some faces were shockingly familiar. People from Shelton Creek, from neighboring farms, people he'd greeted at the general store or seen at church. It was terrifying to realize how deeply this had penetrated the community. Doherty was assessing the situation, trying to calculate if there was any way to intervene without putting the hostages in greater danger. But before he could formulate a plan, Mrs. Blackwood suddenly stopped singing. The entire circle fell silent. Then she spoke, her voice carrying across the clearing with startling clarity. She said she knew there were visitors watching, that she could sense their presence. She invited them to reveal themselves, telling them that hiding was futile. Thomas felt Doherty grip his arm, trying to keep him still, but Mrs. Blackwood's voice had a commanding quality that was difficult to resist. She said that if the observers did not show themselves, the consequences would fall upon those she kept as guests. Thomas couldn't contain himself. He rose from behind the bush where he'd been hiding and walked into the clearing, his hands empty and raised to show he wasn't armed. Doherty cursed under his breath and stood up too, his hand resting on the gun at his belt, but not yet drawing it. Walsh came out last, clutching his Bible to his chest like a shield. The three men walked slowly to the edge of the circle of people. The ritual participants turned to face them, and Thomas felt the weight of all their gazes. There was something uniform about them, as if they weren't looking at each other as individuals, but as part of a single organism. Mrs. Blackwood smiled, a smile that held no joy, only cold satisfaction. She said that Thomas Ellison had finally arrived, that she had waited for him. She spoke of how Martha had been a promising student, someone with true potential, but who had unfortunately allowed outdated family ties to stray from her path. She said that now Martha would need to make a definitive choice, and that this choice would be made in her father's presence, so there would be no doubts or regrets later. Thomas demanded to know what she wanted, what it all meant, why his family had been dragged to this place. Mrs. Blackwood began to explain, her voice taking on an almost professorial tone, as if she were lecturing. She spoke of how the world was changing rapidly, how ancient forms of power were being forgotten and replaced by machines and governments and laws made by men who did not understand the true forces governing existence. She said that her group preserved knowledge that predated Christianity, predating modern civilization, knowledge of how to work with the world's natural energies, how to influence events and people through disciplined will and appropriate ritual. She acknowledged that some might call her practices dark or even evil, but she argued that good and evil were merely arbitrary human constructs. What she and her followers sought was pure power, the ability to shape their own lives and destinies, rather than be shaped by the external forces of society, religion, and chance. She said that Martha had tapped into that power, had felt its allure, and was now at a point where she had to decide. Either she would fully embrace the path and receive the gifts it offered, or she would reject it all and suffer the consequences of that rejection. And her family would share this fate, for better or worse. Reverend Walsh stepped forward at that moment, his voice trembling but firm. He quoted scriptures, speaking about how what Mrs. Blackwood described was exactly the kind of temptation that had existed since ancient times, the promise of power in exchange for one's soul. He implored those around the circle to recognize the error of their ways, that it was not too late to turn back, that mercy and forgiveness were still possible. Some of the circle shifted uncomfortably, as if Walsh's words had touched something deep within them. But most remained impassive, and Mrs. Blackwood simply laughed. She said the Reverend was free to believe her fables, but that in the end, actions had power, and empty words did not. She then turned to Martha and spoke directly to her. She said it was time for Martha to demonstrate her commitment. She pointed to the ground near the fire pit, where a small arrangement of objects lay. She told Martha she must complete a final ritual, using those objects in a specific way that Lady Blackwood would describe, and by doing so, she would permanently seal her place among them. Or she could refuse, and then everyone present would see what happened to those who squandered the gifts offered to them. Martha opened her eyes slowly. For the first time since Thomas had entered the clearing, she seemed aware of his presence. Her eyes met his through the smoke from the fire. Thomas saw confusion, fear, but also something else. He saw his daughter, the real Martha buried beneath layers of manipulation and terror, struggling to emerge. He said her name softly, then louder. He told her he loved her, that nothing she had done was unforgivable, that she could come home, that they would find a way to make everything right. Sarah and Elizabeth also seemed to be emerging from their trances, turning their heads toward Thomas, recognition gradually dawning on their expressions. Mrs. Blackwood saw what was happening, and her expression changed. The mask of calm control slipped, revealing something far more savage and dangerous beneath. She began to speak faster, words in a strange language pouring from her mouth in a steady stream. Silas Garner moved to stand between Thomas and the women, his posture menacing. Sheriff Dougherty finally drew his gun, pointing it at Silas, and ordered everyone to remain where they were, that they were all under arrest for kidnapping and other charges he would formally list later. But his voice sounded small and inadequate against the growing power of the surrounding atmosphere. Martha suddenly screamed, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the forest. She fell to her knees, her hands pressed to her temples. Sarah ran to her daughter, hugging her, and Elizabeth joined them, the three women forming a close-knit group in the center of the hostile circle. Thomas tried to run toward them, but two of the circle members blocked his path. Dougherty shouted his warnings again, but no one was paying attention. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, escalating towards something none of them could have anticipated. And then, through the trees behind them, came new sounds. Voices, many of them, and the sound of people moving quickly through the forest. Help from the village had finally arrived, but had it arrived in time to prevent a tragedy that seemed increasingly inevitable? The sound of men approaching through the forest momentarily broke the collective trance that had gripped the clearing. Mrs. Blackwood turned sharply toward the trees, her expression showing for the first time something resembling concern. Silas Garner took a few steps back, his eyes scanning the edges of the clearing as he calculated his options. The other members of the circle began to stir, some looking at each other uncertainly, as if waking from a dream and suddenly realizing where they were and what they were doing. Approximately 12 men from the village emerged from the trees, some carrying rifles, others with farm tools turned into makeshift weapons. They formed a semicircular line, blocking the main exit routes from the clearing. Among them was Jacob Reeves, the man who had questioned Sheriff Dougherty earlier that morning, but who now stood there, a heavy axe in his hands, his jaw set with determination. Their presence completely changed the dynamic of the situation. Mistress Blackwood and her group were no longer in complete control. Thomas took advantage of the distraction to finally break through the two men blocking him. He ran to where Sarah, Elizabeth, and Martha were huddled together on the ground and wrapped them in his arms. Martha was shaking violently, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were clear now. Whatever had kept her trapped in that semi-conscious state seemed to have snapped with the arrival of reinforcements and the breaking of Mrs. Blackwood's concentration. Sarah held her two daughters close, murmuring prayers under her breath. Elizabeth wept silently, clinging to her mother's dress as she had done when she was little. Sheriff Dougherty raised his voice with renewed authority. He declared that everyone there was being arrested and that they should surrender peacefully or face the consequences of resisting authorities. He listed the charges formally this time: kidnapping, threats, trespassing, and also mentioned the investigation into Mr. Porter's death. At the mention of this last name, several of the circle members paled, and some began to slowly back away toward the edges of the clearing. It was clear that not everyone there knew everything that had been done in the group's name. Mrs. Blackwood stood still for a long moment, her gaze fixed first on the sheriff, then on the village men, and finally on Martha. When she spoke, her voice had lost its former commanding quality. There was a note of bitterness and almost resignation in it now. She said it wouldn't end there, that what had begun in those mountains would continue in one form or another, because the needs her group satisfied, the hunger for power and meaning in difficult lives, wouldn't disappear simply because a few people had been arrested. But even as she spoke, her followers were beginning to disperse, Some of the circle simply ran into the woods, disappearing into the trees before anyone could stop them. Others surrendered immediately, falling to their knees with their hands raised, possibly relieved to finally have an excuse to leave something they had become deeply involved in. Silas Garner tried to flee, but Jacob Reeves and 2 other men intercepted him. There was a brief struggle, but Silas was outnumbered and was soon subdued, his hands bound with rope as he hurled empty threats about what would happen to those who had captured him. Mrs. Blackwood didn't try to escape. She stood there watching as everything she had built crumbled around her. When Sheriff Dougherty approached to arrest her, she looked him in the eye and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. She told him he could arrest her, that he could destroy this particular group, but that she wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last. That there was something in the mountains, in the deep woods, that would always call to certain people, and that there would always be those willing to answer that call. Dougherty didn't respond, simply tied her hands and led her to where the other detainees were being gathered. Thomas helped his family to their feet. Martha was weak, leaning heavily on her father as they walked out of the clearing. Sarah and Elizabeth were physically unharmed, but the emotional trauma was evident on their faces. Reverend Walsh walked beside them, offering gentle words of comfort and assuring them that God had not abandoned them even in their darkest moments. The journey back down the mountain trail was long and exhausting. No one spoke much, everyone silently processing what had happened and beginning to deal with the emotional aftermath of those terrible days. When they finally emerged from the woods near the Ellison property, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon. It had only been a day, but it felt like an eternity since Thomas had ridden to Shelton Creek that morning. The house was exactly as they had left it, the door still ajar, signs of the break-in still visible, but now it felt different. It felt safe. It felt like home again. Sarah entered first, moving as if in a dream, automatically beginning to right the objects that had been knocked over, a way of regaining control over her surroundings. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in those North Carolina mountains spread throughout the county and beyond. Mrs. Blackwood, whose real name was eventually discovered to be Meredith Crane, was tried along with Silas Garner and several other core members of the group. It was never conclusively proven that they had killed Mr. Porter, as no definitive cause of death could be established, but they were convicted on multiple other charges. Some were imprisoned in other parts of the state, places where their influence could not reach. Martha spent months slowly recovering from the trauma. There were good days and bad days, moments when she seemed to be the girl she had been before meeting Silas, and moments when the shadows of those dark months returned to haunt her. Her family surrounded her with love and patience, and gradually, very gradually, she began to find her way back. She never spoke publicly about the details of what she had experienced, but years later, she would confide to Elizabeth that those months had taught her something important about human nature, about how even good people can be led down dark paths when they are seeking meaning or escape from difficult lives. Many of the other members of the group who weren't arrested simply disappeared from the region. Some families moved to other parts of the state or neighboring states, seeking a fresh start where no one would know their story. Others remained, but lived the rest of their lives under the shadow of suspicion and community judgment. The mountain clearing was avoided for years afterward, gaining a dark reputation that caused even the most experienced hunters to find other places to hunt. Eventually, nature reclaimed the space, and young trees began to grow where the fire had burned. The Ellison family was never quite the same again. There are certain experiences that change people permanently, that draw invisible lines dividing life into before and after. But they survived, and more than that, they found ways to move forward. Thomas became more protective, but also more open with his emotions, realizing how fragile life truly was. Sarah strengthened her faith, finding a foundation in it when everything else seemed uncertain. Elizabeth grew up faster than she should have, but carried with her an inner strength that would serve her well throughout her life. And Martha, despite all the visible and invisible scars, survived to tell her story, becoming a silent testament to the dangers that lurk when we lose our way. The Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina hold many secrets within their deep folds and hidden valleys. There are stories that circulate around campfires to this day, stories of things that happened long ago but have never been completely forgotten. Martha Ellison's story became one such narrative, told in hushed tones, serving as a reminder